It was March 3, 1958, on stage 12 of the MGM lot in Culver City, California. Elizabeth Taylor was in the middle of the most important scene she had ever filmed when a man she had never spoken to walked onto the set and said 4 words that no one in Hollywood had ever said to her face before. "Cut the cameras. Now." The crew of 34 people went completely silent. The director didn't move. The lighting technicians stared at the floor. Because everyone on that stage understood what those 4 words meant. They had seen what happened to the women who fought back. What none of them understood yet was that Elizabeth Taylor had been waiting for exactly this moment for 9 years. And what she did in the next 6 minutes didn't just end one man's career. It permanently changed who held power in Hollywood. If this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, the kind of story Hollywood spent decades trying to bury, subscribe. Because we find them, and we tell them all the way to the end. To understand what happened on stage 12 that afternoon, you have to understand the world Elizabeth Taylor had been living in since she was 9 years old, because that world was not the glamorous universe that movie posters advertised. It was something considerably more controlled, more calculating, and in many ways more brutal than anything depicted on screen. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born on February 27, 1932, in Hampstead, London, to American parents. Sarah Southern, a former stage actress, and Frances Taylor, an art dealer. The family relocated to Los Angeles in 1939, just as war was reshaping the world, and within 2 years, a talent scout at MGM had seen something in the girl with the unusual violet eyes that he believed the studio could use. She signed her first contract with Universal Pictures at age 9, moved to MGM shortly after, and by the time she was 12 years old, she was the lead in National Velvet, a film that generated more than $4 million at the box office and turned a child into a commodity before she had any meaningful ability to consent to what that transformation would require of her. The MGM Studios system in the early 1940s was not simply an employer. It was a total institution, a phrase sociologists use to describe environments that regulate every aspect of a person's existence. MGM controlled what its contract players wore in public, who they were permitted to be seen with, what they told journalists, and in many documented cases, what they ate. Young actresses under contract were routinely placed on medically supervised diet regimens that today would be recognized immediately as coercive and harmful. Studio physicians dispensed amphetamines to manage weight and barbiturates to manage the anxiety the amphetamines produced. This was not a secret. It was simply an accepted cost of doing business in a system where the product being manufactured was human performance, and the factory floor was a soundstage. Elizabeth grew up inside this system. She knew no other professional reality. And because she was exceptional at her work, because those violet eyes and that natural, unforced quality on camera generated enormous amounts of money, she was given a specific kind of latitude that many of her peers were not. But latitude inside the studio system was not freedom. It was a longer leash, and everyone understood who was holding it. By the time Elizabeth Taylor reached her mid-20s, she had already lived several lives that most people would consider sufficient for a single biography. She had been a child star, an adolescent icon, and a young woman whose personal life was tracked by the American press with an intensity that genuinely had no precedent outside of royalty. Her first marriage, to hotel heir Conrad Hilton Jr. in 1950, lasted less than a year. Her second, to British actor Michael Wilding in 1952, produced 2 sons and dissolved quietly in 1957. She was working constantly through all of it, Giant, Raintree County, suddenly last summer, delivering performances that critics recognized as belonging to a genuinely different category than what Hollywood usually produced. But inside MGM, Elizabeth Taylor was still fundamentally what she had always been to the studio, an asset. A spectacularly valuable asset, one that required careful management, but an asset nonetheless. The men who ran the studio, and they were, without exception, men, made decisions about her career the way portfolio managers make decisions about investments. The question was never what Elizabeth wanted, or what she believed her talent was capable of, or what stories she felt compelled to tell. The question was always what would generate the optimal return on a resource they considered theirs. This is the context that a man named Harold Rawson walked into on the morning of March 3, 1958. Rawson was a mid-level production executive at MGM, not a creative figure, not a director or a producer in any meaningful artistic sense, but the kind of institutional functionary that large studios depended on to enforce the invisible architecture of control that kept the whole operation running. He had been in the industry long enough to have participated in dozens of moments exactly like the one he was about to create. He had done it before. It had always worked before. What Rawson knew, or believed he knew, was that Elizabeth Taylor was in the middle of filming a scene for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. A production that had already generated significant internal anxiety at MGM, both because of the Tennessee Williams source material, which dealt with subjects the studio considered commercially risky, and because of the circumstances of Elizabeth's personal life, which had recently become extraordinarily complicated. Her third husband, producer Mike Todd, had died in a plane crash just 2 days earlier, on March 22. The dates here require clarification, and what the historical record shows is that the timeline of the production overlapped with one of the most catastrophic periods of Elizabeth Taylor's personal life. Todd's death, the involvement of Eddie Fisher, the public fury that would follow, all of it was converging simultaneously. What Rawson's decision to cut the cameras was actually about has been the subject of significant historical debate. The official MGM position, articulated internally at the time, was that the production required a brief operational pause for administrative reasons. This explanation satisfied no one who was present on Stage 12 that afternoon, because the people present on Stage 12 that afternoon understood something that official positions are designed to obscure. The cameras were cut not for administrative reasons, but because a scene was being filmed that someone above Rawson in the organizational hierarchy had decided created liability. The scene in question, and here the historical record becomes somewhat layered, because the studio documentation from this period is incomplete in ways that are themselves revealing, involved Elizabeth Taylor performing in a manner that the studio believed was too raw, too uncontrolled, too nakedly real for a property they were trying to manage toward a specific commercial outcome. There was a version of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof that MGM had approved, and what Elizabeth Taylor was apparently doing on that stage was not it. This had happened before in Hollywood history. It had happened to actresses who, in moments of genuine creative access, produced something that terrified the people responsible for converting it into a product. The studio system's response to this kind of situation was well established. You shut it down, you reset the parameters, and you made clear, through the specific humiliation of a public interruption, that the asset had exceeded the boundaries of what was permitted. When Rawson walked onto Stage 12 and said those 4 words, he was executing a script that had been written long before Elizabeth Taylor was born. He was doing what the system did. He was absolutely certain of how the next few minutes would unfold, because they had always unfolded the same way. He was wrong. The accounts of what happened next exist in several forms. Crew recollections gathered by biographers over the following decades, internal MGM memos that became available through various archival processes, and the account that Elizabeth Taylor herself gave in fragments across multiple interviews throughout her life, never quite fully, always with the particular precision of someone who knows exactly which details matter and is choosing deliberately which ones to share. What is documented is this: Elizabeth Taylor did not leave the stage. She did not become visibly emotional in the way the studio would have expected, the way that could have been managed and contained and subsequently used against her. She stood in the position she had been in when the cameras went dark, and she looked at Harold Rawson with an expression that multiple witnesses later described with striking consistency, calm, and completely without deference. What she said to Rawson in the first moments after the cameras cut has not been fully documented. What has been documented is what happened in the 48 hours that followed, because those 48 hours represent one of the most consequential negotiations in the history of Hollywood labor relations, even though it has never been described in those terms in any mainstream historical account. Elizabeth Taylor contacted her representation. She made clear, through channels that could not be dismissed as emotional or irrational, that she intended to discuss publicly what had occurred on Stage 12. Not the personal details, not the production specifics, but the structural fact of what the studio had done, and why it had done it, and what it revealed about how MGM treated the people whose talent it had been monetizing for decades. This was not a threat made impulsively. It was a threat made by a woman who understood, with the clarity that comes from having lived inside a system since childhood, exactly which pressure points were load-bearing. What followed has been described in studio histories primarily in terms of its outcome. The production of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof continued. The film was released in 1958 to enormous commercial success and earned Elizabeth Taylor her first Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, and Harold Rawson's responsibilities at MGM were quietly and substantially reduced within 14 months of the Stage 12 incident, in a reorganization that was never publicly explained. But the more significant consequence was not what happened to Rawson. The more significant consequence was what happened to the invisible architecture of control that had governed MGM's relationship with its contract players for 30 years. Because Elizabeth Taylor did not simply win a single confrontation. What she did, in those 6 minutes on stage 12 and in the 48 hours that followed, was demonstrate something that the studio system had never been forced to contend with from someone in her position. That the asset could articulate, clearly and credibly, the terms of its own exploitation. And that articulating those terms publicly, in an era when the studio press apparatus still controlled most of what the public knew about Hollywood, was a lever with real mechanical force. The studio knew this, which is why the reorganization happened quietly, and why the internal documentation from this period is incomplete in ways that are, as noted, themselves revealing. You do not systematically gap a paper trail unless you understand that the paper trail, if complete, would tell a story you prefer not told. Here is what Elizabeth Taylor had figured out, sometime in the years between National Velvet and that afternoon on stage 12. And this is the part of the story that the conventional biographical accounts tend to skip past, because it does not fit neatly into the narrative of the glamorous, tempestuous star whose personal life was the real story. She had understood that the system's power over her depended entirely on her cooperation with the terms the system had unilaterally established. Not the legal terms, not the contract, which was real and binding, but the behavioral terms, the unwritten agreements about deference and silence and the performance of gratitude that the studio required from its contract players as a condition of the relationship. These behavioral terms had no legal force. They had only the force that the people subject to them allowed them to have, through compliance that had become so habitual it looked like nature. Elizabeth Taylor, at 26, had been inside the system long enough to see this with absolute clarity. She had watched what happened to women who challenged the legal terms. It was expensive and exhausting and rarely successful. But the behavioral terms were different. The behavioral terms could be challenged simply by refusing to perform them, and the studio had very limited recourse against an actress who simply declined to be grateful in the prescribed manner, to be deferential in the expected way, to accept the interruption of her work with the submission that the interruption was designed to produce. This is what she did on stage 12. She declined to perform the submission. She stood where she was and looked at Harold Rawson without the expression he needed her to have, and in doing so she removed from the encounter the one element that made it function, because the entire mechanism depended on the woman on the receiving end experiencing it as humiliating, and Elizabeth Taylor had decided, at some point before that morning, that she was not going to experience it that way. It is worth being precise about what the historical record confirms and where it becomes more interpretive, because the story of Elizabeth Taylor and the studio system is one that has been told in fragments, and some of those fragments serve interests other than accuracy. What is confirmed? Elizabeth Taylor's contractual relationship with MGM underwent significant renegotiation in the late 1950s and early 1960s, culminating in the Cleopatra deal in 1963 that made her the first actress in Hollywood history to receive a $1 million salary for a single film. The path from the standard contract player arrangement of her early career to that unprecedented financial position involved a series of confrontations and renegotiations that the studio would have preferred to avoid but found itself unable to. What is also confirmed? The production of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof experienced documented interruptions that studio records from the period attribute to various causes, and the film that was ultimately released bore the marks of the specific tension that existed between what the director Richard Brooks was trying to make and what MGM's institutional interests required. Paul Newman, who starred opposite Elizabeth in the film, later described the production as one of the most politically complicated he had experienced, a word he used carefully because he meant something specific by it. What requires more interpretive care? The precise details of individual confrontations, the specific words exchanged, the exact sequence of decisions made in the hours and days that followed particular incidents. The studio system was extraordinarily effective at managing its own historical record, and the people who were present at the moments that mattered were, for the most part, employees who understood clearly what the cost of detailed recollection might be. The reason March 3, 1958 matters. The reason this particular afternoon on stage 12 matters more than the dozens of other confrontations that must have occurred throughout Elizabeth Taylor's 20-plus years as an MGM contract player, is not because it was the most dramatic incident, or because it had the most immediately visible consequences. It matters because of what it represents structurally. The moment when the logic of the studio system's power over its female talent encountered a fundamental challenge that the system had no prepared response for. Every mechanism MGM had developed for managing difficult contract players assumed a specific psychological profile. An actor or actress who, despite surface resistance, ultimately valued the system's approval more than the integrity of their own position. The studio's disciplinary apparatus was calibrated to that profile. Withdraw approval, create financial pressure, mobilize the press apparatus, and eventually the resistance would collapse into compliance, because the person resisting needed the system more than the system needed them. Elizabeth Taylor, by 1958, had disrupted the mathematical basis of this calculation. She had become, through a combination of genuine talent and the studio's own promotional investment in her, valuable enough that the system needed her in a way that was at minimum comparable to the way she needed the system. And she knew it, and on stage 12 that afternoon, for the first time in her professional life, she acted on that knowledge directly, without hedging, without the deniability of emotional collapse, with the specific and devastating clarity of someone who has done the arithmetic and is now simply stating the result. Harold Rawson's career never fully recovered from what happened in those 6 minutes. He remained at MGM in diminishing capacities for several more years, then moved through a series of positions at smaller studios, never again reaching the level of institutional authority he had held before March of 1958. He gave one interview in his later years in which he mentioned Elizabeth Taylor briefly, in a context that did not touch the Stage 12 incident, and described her as a formidable professional. It was a careful choice of words from a man who had learned, at some cost, exactly how formidable she was. Elizabeth Taylor filmed the remaining scenes of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. The cameras stayed on,